Animals are weird because all animals pretty much make their babies by combining egg and sperm. Those two types of reproductive cells, and they're universal across the animal kingdom. Um, and yet, the ways that any given animal determines which one it's going to make are incredibly diverse. So we, I think, often don't learn about this in school. We may learn that the way humans do it is with sex chromosomes. If a human has an X and a Y sex chromosome, then we make sperm. And if we have an X and an X chromosome, then we make eggs. And I think once we learn that, we might assume that that's just how animals do it. But it's actually really weird. We're oddballs. A lot of animals do it very, very differently.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Danna Staff. Danna is a marine biologist, author, and artist. She earned her PhD from Stanford University while studying baby squid at Hopkins Marine Station. Her writing has appeared in Science, Atlas Obscura, and IO9, and her first book, Squid Empire: The Rise and Fall of the Cephalopods, was named one of the best science books of the year by NPR's Science Friday. Her upcoming book is Nursery Earth: The Wondrous Lives of Baby Animals and the Extraordinary Ways They Shape Our World. Her recent story in Nautilus was Animal Sex Determination is Weirder Than You Think. Parasites, weather, and luck can play a role in determining whether some animals are male or female. Danna, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
All right, to start off, could you summarize your intellectual and academic background a bit and describe the kind of stories you've been drawn to telling as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied both biology and literature in college, and then I went on to graduate school and I got a PhD in marine biology, as you mentioned, and I was studying squid sex. And those are really the two topics that I think I continue to be most drawn to: the invertebrates, so the vast majority of animals that don't have backbones, that I think don't get quite as much attention. And so I'm always sniffing around for invertebrate stories and examples of the spineless wonders around us. And reproduction and life cycles just continues to be a topic of perennial interest to me. There's always new research on what's going on with animals making more animals, and it's really fundamental to the existence of life on Earth.
Can you say what drew you to that area of science? What captured your curiosity about marine biology and reproductive biology?
Yeah, I think the marine biology grabbed me at a very young age. I went to an aquarium when I was 10, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and I saw an octopus, a big octopus, for the first time. And I had that moment that I think a lot of people do when they first see an octopus, of realizing that there's something looking back at you, that has a lot of cognitive power, that has a lot of sort of interest and behavior and capacity, things that are familiar to us, and yet it's in a body that's completely unfamiliar to us. It's got no bones, it's got 8 wiggly arms and suction cups, and that sealed the deal for me with both marine biology and invertebrates. So it was like, these things are like aliens on Earth, and I need to know more about them. And then I think the life cycle interest came a little bit later as I was getting into my research on squid in particular, and I was studying how they make these itty bitty little hatchlings that are like the size of a grain of rice, and the particular species I was studying gets almost as big as me as an adult. And I was learning that was pretty common in invertebrates, that they have very small babies and they have lots of them, like thousands or millions. And those tiny, abundant babies are sort of filling the ocean and really like feeding a lot of other animals and then developing into adults. And I just got that whole transformation was like the caterpillar to butterfly transformation that I think we all kind of love the first time we learn about it, but it was happening in like so many different animals, so many different ways.
Mm. All right, once again, your new story, Nautilus, is Animal Sex Determination is Weirder Than You Think. Could you give us a brief summary of the story for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So animals are weird because all animals pretty much make their babies by combining egg and sperm. Those two types of reproductive cells, and they're universal across the animal kingdom. Um, and yet, the ways that any given animal determines which one it's going to make are incredibly diverse. So we, I think, often don't learn about this in school. We may learn that the way humans do it is with sex chromosomes. If a human has an X and a Y sex chromosome, then we make sperm. And if we have an X and an X chromosome, then we make eggs. And I think once we learn that, we might assume that that's just how animals do it. But it's actually really weird. We're oddballs. A lot of animals do it very, very differently. A lot of reptiles don't use genetics at all, much less entire chromosomes. They determine whether their body is going to make sperm or eggs based on the temperature they experience as embryos. And even within that, it's not like hot temperatures always make sperm producing males and cold temperatures always make egg producing females. Some species do that, and then some are the other way around. And some have it's like an intermediate temperature that goes one way and the extremes go the other way. And then the more I got into this, the more excited I got. There are insects, in particular, there are roly-polies, little pill bugs, that determine their sex based on whether they're infected with a particular bacterium. And if they're infected, then they become female, and if they're not, then they become male. So there's and the closer, the more scientists look, the more they discover this incredible diversity of sex determination systems. And so the article is really about introducing people to that diversity, and then also like showing how that a lot of these systems are being affected by human change to the environment. Climate change is influencing the temperature-driven ones. A lot of them are being influenced by different sort of human impacts on the environment. And they're changing all the time, even without our influence. So scientists are discovering ways that these systems are just evolving as animals adapt to their environment. And so studying them is teaching scientists both about how evolution works and about how we can conserve the species that really need it.
Would a fair definition of sex, as you discuss it in the story, be just females produce eggs, males produce sperm, or is there any more wrinkle to
That's
that?
That's the way those words are used in biology to keep it really simple. And even with many animals and plants are hermaphrodites, meaning the organism as a whole produces both eggs and sperm. And in those situations, the organs within that organism that produce eggs are called the female organs, the female sex organs. They're ovaries, usually like the ovaries that exist in a flower, for example. And the organs within that organism that produce sperm would be called the male organs. So those terms can be used to both describe the entire organism if that organism produces only eggs or only sperm, or they can be used to describe the organs within a hermaphroditic organism. So like I have some pet snails that are hermaphrodites, and within them each one has both male and female sex organs.
Okay. Do we have a sense of how many species are hermaphrodites versus ones that don't have any hermaphrodites in their population? Is it pretty
That's a
common?
great question. I wish I had a number and I don't offhand, but what's interesting is it's not as common in animals as it is in plants. It's much more common for plants to produce both male and female. So like for a flowering plant, for example, to produce both the pollen, which is the fertilizing male sex cells packaged up, as well as the flowers with the ovaries that will receive the pollen and turn into fruit. That's really common in plants. And then in animals, it's less common. It's not really known from mammals and birds and reptiles. So again, here's where vertebrates, it's pretty uncommon. And so, but then in invertebrates, there are so many different ways that they do it. So some invertebrates have completely separate sexes. In fact, my favorites, the octopuses and squid, there's no known hermaphroditic octopus or squid. But their close relatives, the snails, are almost all hermaphroditic. And they're what's called simultaneous, meaning that they have the male and the female organs at the same time in their bodies. But then a lot of fish are sequential hermaphrodites, meaning that they'll develop first as one, either male or female, and then as they go through their life, they'll switch to producing the other one.
That's incredible. What inspired you or gave you an impetus to write the story now?
So I came across the some of the research that I present in it while I was doing research for my book Nursery Earth, because that book is all about animal development, and one of the important facets of how an animal is developing is how it develops into either male or female or hermaphrodite as it's sort of building its body from an embryo. And that's where I ran across the story of these roly-polies that depend on a bacterium, and it was just like, this is totally wild. And the more I got into it, the more I was like, this is kind of a whole separate story. And so there's not actually very much about it in Nursery Earth. And I was really excited to have an opportunity to really dig into it for Nautilus. And then once I got into it, I started learning more. There was there was just so much more to it. So it was really fun. And to realize that a lot of this research is, I was reading papers that had just come out in the last couple of months that and the scientists that I was able to interview are learning things sort of right now, actually seeing on the ground when they go out in the field changes, some of which are in response to climate change, like the bearded dragons in Australia, that they've sort of just discovered some of them that are switching from using a sex chromosome to using a temperature dependent sex determination system. So it was really exciting to discover how much is happening right now in the field.
Yeah, it was a neat part in your story, if I remember correctly, where you mentioned a scientist who years ago had theorized that an organism determined their sex in a really peculiar, interesting way. And then another scientist more recently was able to confirm that experimentally and called him up and let him know that he was right. Was that right?
Yeah, that was another really exciting thing. So the um, the techniques that scientists have on hand to use in the laboratory have gotten so much more sophisticated, and so this theory was the roly-polies, and it was the ones that use bacteria to determine if they're infected with the bacteria, they develop as female, and if they're not infected, they develop as male. And then this scientist, decades ago, had found some of those roly-polies that didn't have the bacteria but were still developing as female, and they theorized that these roly-polies had borrowed the what were called feminizing influences or feminizing genes from the bacteria, and basically like stolen those genes and put them into their own genome. But at the time, there was no way to study that. It's a process called horizontal gene transfer, and the very idea of it was really new. And then this researcher that I spoke to was able just a few years ago, with much more advanced genetic molecular techniques in the laboratory, to prove that that's what had happened, that the genetic material from the bacteria had been transferred into the genome of the roly-polies. I just thought it was such an exciting, like, how often do you live to see that validation? It's really cool.
Totally, yeah. Could you briefly sketch the kind of like the evolutionary pressures and the story of how that came to be the way that they determine their sex? Like that seems so crazy that it would be this
It's
other
so
organism.
Yeah, it's so wild. And what happens is that it is this sort of conflict of interest, because the Wolbachia is the name of the bacterium is Wolbachia. And Wolbachia is a bacterial strain that infects lots of arthropods. Lots of different insects have it. The roly-polies have it. They're all over the place doing all kinds of weird things. And they get transmitted from parent to child in the egg. So this is kind of one of the core differences between egg and sperm, that the egg is a large cell that is packaged with not just the genes of the mother, but lots of other material as well, mitochondria, and in this case, bacteria. And so when the roly-polies have their babies, if they're infected with Wolbachia, the Wolbachia go into the eggs, but they can't go into the sperm. The sperm is too small. It can't hold the Wolbachia. And so from the Wolbachia's point of view, is it better for its host to make eggs or to make sperm? Well, it wants to get transmitted to the next generation. So it's much better for the Wolbachia if its host makes eggs. And because that's so
Mm.
advantageous, Wolbachia has evolved these feminizing influences to turn their hosts into solely egg producing machines, basically, which means Wolbachia proliferating machines. So that's
Mm.
advantageous for the Wolbachia. But if they make all of their hosts female to the point that there aren't any more males in the population, then the population dies out because there won't be
Mm.
any sperm to fertilize those eggs. And that's also bad for the Wolbachia. And so there ends up being this like sort of balancing act between host and parasite, or host and symbiont. It's hard to even say whether it's truly a parasite, of how strongly they feminize their hosts. And so it seems like there have been cases where the population has um, acquired, like, originally there are roly-polies with no Wolbachia in them, and they have chromosomes that determine their sex, but they don't have XY chromosomes like humans. Just to make it more complicated, they have a different set of sex chromosomes called ZW, and if you're ZW,
Mm.
you're female, and if you're double Z, then you're male. And so that was the original state. And there's still plenty of roly polies that do that. And then there's some of them that have been infected with Wolbachia. And the Wolbachia were like, we'll take over. We're in charge of making females now. And so they've lost their ZW sex chromosomes. And then from there, and this has all happened, evolutionary biologists call it recently, but it's been millions of years. But it's within not going back to dinosaur times, essentially, like within the last few million years, that all of this has happened, and that they can track it is very recent, just in the last few years, that the molecular tools are there to track how the changes have taken place. Anyway, I got a little carried away, but I like roly polies.
No, that's really fascinating. Thanks for that explanation. Can you tell us about any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas you came across in your reporting or research that, for whatever reason, didn't end up making it into the story?
There's so many. So fungus, I have to tell you about fungus because that's a whole other kingdom. So we have life divided into plants and animals and fungus, and of course microbes and bacteria. And what's wild to me is that both plants and animals have this division of reproductive cells into male and female, sperm and eggs. And even though many of them are hermaphrodites, many of them have separate sexes, regardless, both of those groups of life have those very distinctive, one large resource rich sex cell and one small speedy sex cell. But fungus do not. Fungi are totally different, and they do produce sex cells, which means like cells that are created for reproduction to merge with each other to produce a new organism. But those are not eggs and sperm. They have what are called mating types, and depending on the fungus, they can have dozens or even hundreds of them. And there's this complex system of which ones are compatible with which other ones. And I'm definitely not a fungal biologist, nor did I speak to a mycologist for this, so I'm not going to try to get into too much detail. But it's totally wild to me that that entire group is like, we can produce the next generation without needing to really pare it down. We can have all of this diversity in mating types, and they'll figure out how to sort of allocate their genes and mix with each other and make the next generation. And yet all animals and all plants got this incredibly narrow set of sex cells. So that's wild. And then the other one is that going back in history, I really was interested in how human understanding of sex determination has changed, because we didn't used to know even about chromosomes, of course. And so if you go back in time to like Aristotle, which is kind of like the first sort of Western European tradition of writing down ideas about things. So often scientists are like, well, what did Aristotle say about it? And then we can prove how wrong he was. Well, he thought that human sex was temperature dependent, which is hilarious because it's not, but also like he was onto something, because a lot of animals do have temperature dependent sex. And people used to do all kinds of things to try to influence the sex of their babies or the babies of their farm animals, because it was often really important. If you had cows, did you want more cows or did you want more bulls? Depending on what you want. And they would like mix herbs in the food and try to conceive at different times of year. And there was one story I read about women who would try to keep a whole egg in the top part of their dress. And if you could keep it that way the whole pregnancy without breaking it, then you were more likely to have a male. child. I don't remember, but it's pretty funny.
It makes me think, were people in the ancient world aware that animals could change their sex at different parts of their life, or that like other factors besides just when the animal comes out of the womb or the egg and it's not determined yet, or um, it's just rigidly
It
set?
was
I mean, were there
a
any?
lot of that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, yeah, that was the end of my question.
A lot of that stuff was only discovered recently, standing because so much of the weirdness is in invertebrates. Vertebrates are tend to be pretty boring, and so like all the farm animals that people were keeping, and uh, even birds that and birds do have a different set of sex chromosomes than humans do, but even so, it's not something that changes over the course of their lives. So all the sort of sequential hermaphroditism was a much more recent discovery.
Okay. What are you working on now?
So my book Nursery Earth is coming out in June, and in anticipation of that, I've been creating a series of illustrations about animal mothers that produce milk that are not the ones that we tend to think about. And so this is sort of in the run up to Mother's Day, and also as a like something that is building out of the book because I didn't have enough time. Or I didn't really have enough space in the book to put all these illustrations in, so I'm making them right now. So I'm making a whole chart of all of these really heartwarming mother child interactions between, for example, cockroach mothers and their broods of cockroach babies. Not all cockroaches do this, but the Pacific beetle mimic cockroach actually produces milk inside her abdomen for her babies to drink as they're growing. And then she gives live birth to these large milk fed baby cockroaches. And then I also getting into sharks, which many people know that there are sharks that give live birth, but a lot of those sharks actually produce uterine milk inside their uterus to feed their babies before they come out. And I just think those are some really beautiful stories that I'd like to get out in the world.
Totally. That sounds like a lovely idea. I love that. All right. To close out, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Are you on social media, or do you have a website people can check out?
Yeah, I've got a website, which is just my name, dannastaff.com. And I'm on Twitter as Danna Staff and Instagram as Danna Joy Staff. But I think you can find me by just searching for Danna Staff. And my publisher is trying to get me on TikTok. So I did just make an account. If people like watching me talk, then I'll try to be doing a little bit more of that.
Excellent. That's great. Dana, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Same. Thanks so much.